When disaster strikes, who profits? That's the question asked by journalist Antony Loewenstein in his new book, Disaster Capitalism, Making a Killing Out of Catastrophe. Traveling across the globe, Antony examines how companies such as G4S, Serco, Halliburton are cashing in on calamity. He describes how they're deploying for-profit private contractors to war zones and building for-profit private detention facilities to warehouse refugees, prisoners, asylum seekers. Now Loewenstein has teamed up with filmmaker Thor Neureiter for an upcoming documentary by the same name that chronicles how international aid and investment has impacted communities from Haiti to Afghanistan to Papua New Guinea and beyond. This is the trailer.
For 3 years, I've investigated what happens after the spotlight fades from disasters in developing countries. What comes when the money and goodwill ends?
This country is like a republic of NGOs, and these people as employees, they are getting paid very fat salaries.
Often these natural and man-made disasters create an atmosphere reliant on foreign money.
They say first we should bring security, then investment. I say we should invest, then security will come.
When aid runs out and most NGOs move on to the next disaster, pro-business policies are created in the name of recovery. This investigation has taken me to the streets of Haiti, the mountains of Afghanistan and the lush forests of Papua New Guinea, where I've met the people caught up in a struggle between recovery and the policies that cater to foreign interests.
When you talk about disaster capitalism and the capitalists coming in and sweeping up and taking over, they don't need a conspiracy because those are the interests that prevail and they're going to get their way.
The trailer for the forthcoming documentary based on Antony Loewenstein's new book, Disaster Capitalism, Making a Killing Out of Catastrophe. Well, journalist and author Antony Loewenstein joins us now in studio, also a columnist for The Guardian. Welcome back to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us, Antony. So explain disaster capitalism.
People who make money from misery. So one of the reasons I was inspired by Naomi Klein's book, The Shock Doctrine, she coined the term disaster capitalism in 2007. For me, it was really about deepening and widening that definition. So I focused particularly on Afghanistan, Haiti, Papua New Guinea, US, UK, Greece and Australia. Immigration is a key part of that. So the fact that, as you said in your introduction, there are key companies, G4S, Transfield, Serco and others, who are very happy about their massive influx of refugees. Warehousing refugees is huge profit-making business. So I was focusing on that, going to these places and actually seeing the effects of that on both immigrants and also those who work in those centres. Looking at, say, in Haiti, the issue of aid and development after the earthquake in 2010, which is a key reason why the US government, as WikiLeaks documents showed, were keen for US contractors to make a fortune. In Papua New Guinea, a country near my own country, Australia, a situation where you have massive mining interests, Rio Tinto and others, again making a fortune from mining and misery. So for me, it was about making the connections between various different countries and corporations and saying, I'm not arguing that Afghanistan is the same as Greece, of course they're different, but ultimately often the same corporations are at play, and the fact that the corporation has become more powerful than the state, which to me is a problem.
I want to ask you about a place some call the Guantanamo Bay of the Pacific. The Manus Island detention center is paid for by the Australian government and run by an Australian contractor, Transfield Services, but located offshore on Papua New Guinea's soil. The prisoners are not accused of any crimes. They're asylum seekers from war-ravaged countries who are waiting indefinitely for their refugee status determination. Earlier this year, Democracy Now! Spoke to Australian human rights lawyer Jennifer Robinson about Manus Island.
I've been to PNG and I've spent times in West Papuan refugee settlement camps, so I can speak with first-hand experience that PNG is not a state that is capable of accepting our asylum seekers and refugees. 90% of these people who come by boat to Australia have been determined to be refugees in the past. The conditions in PNG are terrible. It is unlawful for Australia to be continuing to send asylum seekers to conditions the UN has found to amount to inhuman and degrading treatment. We are in breach of our international obligations.
That's Australian human rights lawyer Jen Robinson, Antony Loewenstein.
It's a problem. I mean, one of the things also we should also say is there's Manus Island in Papua New Guinea, but also Nauru, which is a Pacific island. So Australia for the last years has been sending thousands of refugees to essentially prison camps in these islands. As you rightly say, they run for profit. It was G4S, it's now Transfield. In a recent Australian Senate report, it was found clear evidence that often refugees are being raped and tortured. This is not an allegation, this is a fact. There was one allegation by a guard that he saw evidence of waterboarding. So ultimately we have a situation where the Australian government, which increasingly I might add is being used by the European Union as inspiration potentially how to deal with their refugee crisis. The key point about the offshore detention camps and indeed onshore in Australia is that they're privately run. And the key problem, it wouldn't make a difference if it was publicly run, I mean they shouldn't be there in the first place, but Australia wants an unaccountable system. Journalists can't get there, as Jennifer rightly said. You essentially have it's a black site. The journalists can't get in there, human rights workers can't get in there. You can visit Manus Island as a tourist, but you can't get into the centre. Nauru charges $8,000 to apply for a visa. And if you don't get the visa, which you wouldn't, you don't get that money back. So essentially many Australians, and sadly I would argue only a minority of Australians, are outraged by this. But the truth is, like in Europe and like in the US, after decades in my country of privatised detention camps, sadly a lot of people regard those people as a threat who need to be essentially seen as silenced and as a number. That's all. It's a massive problem, and I write about that in the book.
I want to go to the larger issue of for-profit prisons. Last month, the Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders, the Democratic presidential candidate, introduced new legislation aimed at banning government contracts with private prisons. Sanders said banning for-profit incarceration is the first step to ending the system of mass incarceration.
As a first step, we need to start treating prisoners like human beings. Private companies, private corporations should not be profiteering from their incarceration.
That's presidential candidate Bernie Sanders, also a senator, so has introduced legislation.
So encouraging. I mean, one of the things that is less talked about in the US, Jeb Bush, Hillary Clinton, Marco Rubio have taken massive amounts of money from the private prison industry. I'm not saying that their policies are solely based around that, but it's an important part in the book. I visit some private detention camps in Georgia, particularly run by CCA, which is the largest American privatised corporation running prisons and detention camps. In these centres, human rights are awful. Healthcare is bad, food is bad, mental health is bad, and ultimately, like we see in Australia and the UK and elsewhere.
And CCA is Correction Corporation of America.
Indeed. Indeed. And ultimately, I think one of the things is these corporations have no incentive to provide decent care. I mean, that's the bottom line. Profit, of course, is the most important. So putting aside the rights of refugees and immigrants themselves, what I find also in the book is that the guards who are working in those centres without proper training, they're almost by definition going to abuse refugees. That's part of the problem. I think Bernie Sanders' call was an important one, but sadly no other major candidate has come out and agreed. And I think one of the interesting things in the US as we move forward with your presidential campaign, someone like a Donald Trump who talks, as we know, about potentially getting rid of 11 million undocumented migrants, the private prison industry is very excited about his presidency, and they're scared of any serious reform in the US. One of the things that CCA and Geo Group, the two major companies, talk about in their annual reports are that serious reform, in other words, less people locked up, is bad for business. And they've spent over the last 20 years at least $30 to $40 million. One of the things that comes out in my book and my investigations is that this is legalised corruption, that it's not illegal for CCA to assist a congressman and woman in their campaign. That's legal. But the problem is that the result in state after state in the US is a mass incarceration culture. And sadly, even under the President Obama, there's been no serious look at removing that incentive. I mean, there's a Congress-approved quota that every single night there are 34,000 refugees locked up in the US, every night.
Richard Sullivan, this is from The Intercept, I believe, of the lobbying group Capital Council, is a bundler for the Clinton campaign, bringing in $44,859 in contributions in a few short months. Sullivan is also a registered lobbyist for the Geo Group, a company that operates a number of jails, including immigrant detention centers for profit.
That's the nexus, Amy, that I'm talking about in the book, that, as again, this sort of thing is not illegal. It is legal, but the problem is that almost by definition that means that major candidates, Hillary Clinton, as I said, Jeb Bush, particularly Marco Rubio in his state as well, has taken massive contributions, and the fact is without those contributions, their policies will be different, obviously.
I want to turn to Afghanistan. Wednesday marked the 14th anniversary of the U.S. war in Afghanistan, which began on October 7, 2001. President Obama declared an official end to the U.S. combat mission in Afghanistan last year. However, the U.S. has around 9,800 troops there, and according to Foreign Policy magazine, there are 3 times as many for-profit private contractors in Afghanistan than U.S. troops, not including the contractors supporting the CIA, State Department, USAID, or other government agencies. You've traveled to Afghanistan, Antony Loewenstein, and spoke to some of these contractors. What did they tell you?
They're worried about the war winding down. For them, they are scared about... I was there in 2012 and also this year in May, in 2015, and one of the things that many of them were saying, both in 2012 and in 2015, is that they realise that the US is winding down its war. But ultimately, as you say, Obama has declared the war finished. It's been rebranded. The occupation continues. There is now talk about possibly raising troops. The Afghan security forces, which I might add, were trained by private companies. DynCorp trained the Iraqi security forces and the Afghan security forces. Massive failures on both fronts, which has had no impact on DynCorp getting more contracts, I might add. So ultimately, one of the things in Afghanistan and the attack on the Kunduz Medical Centre, MSF Medical Centre, goes to the heart of that. There's a reduction in space for humanitarian actors. And when I was there this year with my film partner Thor Neureiter, we're looking at what Afghanistan's likely to look like in the next 5 or 10 years. And the resource industry is what the Afghan government and the US government talks about. Briefly, there are apparently $4 trillion of resources under the ground in Afghanistan, mostly untapped, including copper. And one of the things we do in our film is go to an area called, in Logar province, about an hour from Kabul, which has the largest copper deposit in the world, run by a Chinese company. They are desperate to start mining those resources. And the problem is, in the last years, the US has given hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars to support a resource industry there. So the nexus between private security and mining industry in that country is devastating for the local people.
I wanted to go to testimony just yesterday in the House. The U.S. commander in Afghanistan, General John Campbell, is pushing to keep more U.S. troops in Afghanistan than under President Obama's scheduled drawdown following the Taliban seizure of Kunduz last week. California Congresswoman Loretta Sanchez pressed General Campbell during his testimony to the House Armed Services Committee Thursday.
So, within your own current testimony, let alone the testimony that Mr. Jones brought before you from before, you basically are saying, I don't know that there's a long-term viability for these security forces. We're paying the majority of that. How much is the majority? How much money does that mean to have a force that you don't believe has a long-term viability?
Ma'am,
how much? How much? That's the question. How much?
Yes, ma'am. Today, for calendar year 15, the United States put $4.1 billion to build the Afghan security forces. For 16,
$4.1 billion.
$3.86 billion.
Thank you. $4.1 billion.
Every year we'll continue to reduce that by gaining efficiencies. We're not providing infrastructure that we have.
I've heard this. I've heard this for 14 years.
This comes as Doctors Without Borders says 24 of its staff members are still missing following the U.S. airstrike on its hospital in Kunduz Saturday. That's in addition to at least 22 people who died in the strike, including 12 medical workers, 10 patients, including 3 children. Antony Loewenstein.
I mean, what that testimony shows is that the U.S. has spent over $100 billion since 2001. As you say, this 14-year anniversary now. And even the U.S. government itself, CIGAR, which is the sort of the government arm to investigate where money has gone, has found that the vast majority of that has gone to corruption. It's disappeared. It's gone to helping a failing mining industry. It's gone to pay private security. Afghanistan is one of the great disgraces in some ways of our time, because in many ways the fact that private companies, US companies, Australian companies, British companies have been used as a replacement for government. One of the things that's so often ignored, and I talk about this in the book, is that the US routinely was paying to transport goods from A to B, Afghan security, private security or foreign security, to basically give money to pay off insurgents, to not hit them, to not attack them. So really the US taxpayer is weirdly either comfortable or doesn't know about the fact that America is fighting a war against insurgents that they're also paying off to not attack them. It's a crazy situation, but that's what's been happening for years.
I want to end with Haiti. This year marks the 5th anniversary of the devastating Haiti earthquake that killed 300,000 people and left more than 1.5 million Haitians homeless in what was already the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. In tent camps housing the displaced Haitian residents, and international donors have left them behind.
Moun My message to the international donors is that the money they give to help the people in Haiti is being put to use for the interest of other people instead. It is used to buy luxury cars, pay for hotels, and go to high-priced restaurants, paid in US dollars.
I don't see a future here. I can't hide anything from you. There is no tomorrow. Last night the children went to bed without anything to eat.
Lay out what's happened in Haiti, Antony.
Soon after the Haiti earthquake in 2010, the US ambassador at the time, WikiLeaks document showed this, wrote a cable essentially saying that a gold rush is on. A gold rush meaning for US corporations and others. The US has spent billions of dollars there, mostly for US contractors. Most of the money the US has spent there since the earthquake has remained in America. Haitians have not really been trained, Haitians have not really been supported. The solution that the Obama administration gave for Haiti, pushed by Obama, Hillary Clinton, Bill Clinton and Chelsea Clinton, their daughter, were industrial parks, essentially places that Haitians can get underpaid and not trained to make cheap clothing for Gap and Walmart that you and I maybe, hopefully, won't buy in the US. That's the solution that the US sees for Haiti. Many Haitians, actually also argue that they feel occupied by foreign interests, the UN and the US.
Democracy Now! Went down to Haiti a number of times before and after the earthquake, and I remember one of those times, President Clinton, he was down in Haiti, giving a speech saying there's two things he cares about in the world. One is his daughter's wedding. She was just Chelsea. Clinton was about to get married. And the other is restoring Haiti.
Well, the legacy of the Clinton Foundation, and I examine this deeply in the book, is utterly appalling. There are example after example of the Clinton Foundation funding a number of centres that have been infected by chemicals, which also, I might add, the Clinton Foundation were investing in failed things after Hurricane Katrina as well here in the US. Bill Clinton, Hillary Clinton and others, they're one example. Their solution has primarily been industrial parks. And one of the things that comes out very clearly, the suggestions, and we talk about this in our film as well, that the solution for Haiti is not to build massive industrial parks to make clothing that you and I can buy in the US. The solution is empowering locals. It's about speaking to locals and saying, we actually have a solution that empowers you and trains you. And one of the things that comes out also clearly is that so many Haitians feel pretty pissed off with the fact that so often there's actually little or no encouragement of them. And ultimately, Haiti really has never been an independent country, Amy. The US has had involvement there for 100 years. And many Haitians ultimately feel that they actually really need to separate themselves from the US, but America doesn't actually view that as a viable option. And the book goes into detail about why that is the case. Haiti is seen as too economically viable for America to let it go.
Finally, where do you see the hope in this dark history of multinational corporations and the plunder of the most vulnerable?
The hope are hearing local stories, and one of the things I talk about in the book and we do in the film is actually say that so many in the media, and I'm obviously part of that and you are as well, and Democracy Now! Is an exception to this, but too often don't report local stories, don't actually hear local people saying what they want. So when a disaster strikes in Haiti, don't just focus on celebrities like Sean Penn, focus on other people actually there who are doing good work, empower them, pay them, train them. It's not rocket science how to change this. Ultimately, Haiti's economic structure, as one example, needs to change, but it's not going to change from US contractors doing the job.
Antony Loewenstein's new book is Disaster Capitalism, Making a Killing Out of Catastrophe. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. When we come back, the new U.S. Poet Laureate. Stay with us.